Conversation series. We come to you from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Métis people, where we drink water from Treaty 3, and we are governed by the promises of Treaty 1 and also the Manitoba Act. And for a long time, the Critical Conversation series provided a way to combine a senior level course with a seminar open to a wider public. And for many years before the pandemic, this was done in person. We've kept with the spirit and intent of this format. And like so many of the other things in this last couple of years, we've moved it online. This year, the course that this runs in conjunction with focuses on how historians and public history professionals, broadly defined, have both addressed and failed to address a wide range of historical events and processes that might be considered under the big tent of human rights violations or atrocities within the context of Canada and both the Indigenous and the colonial territories that preceded it. We are asking how scholars, both inside and outside the academy, have addressed a historical record and a present that includes slavery, dispossession, incarceration, forced removal, and a range of other difficult and troubling histories. How have languages of human rights that have circulated so widely since the post-war era either helped shape historians and public history professionals' response to these histories? What are the limits and the possibilities of a framework of human rights and Indigenous rights for accounting for and engaging with the range of difficult histories and presents we live with in Canada? Today, we are enormously honored to be joined by Dr. Harvey Amani Whitfield, who is Professor of History at the University of Calgary. He has a PhD from Dalhousie University and taught at the University of Vermont for a while, I think quite a while, before taking up the current position. Dr. Whitfield's books have, I think, played a critical role in the rethinking of histories of slavery and unfreedom in Canada. I'll draw your attention to two of these. North to Bondage, Loyalist Slavery in the Maritimes, published by UBC Press in 2016. And more recently, 2022's Biographical Dictionary of Enslaved Black People in the Maritimes, published by the University of Toronto Press. These works are crucial to the process of reimagining Canadian history through the lenses and histories of slavery, unfreedom, and Blackness. Today, Professor Whitfield will be speaking to this research on the particular topics of experiences of enslaved Black people in colonial Canada. I think he's planning to speak for about half an hour. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions. We are recording. And with all of that, I will turn things over to the patient and technologically adept Dr. Whitfield, who we are so grateful to be joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Dr. Perry for inviting me. It's great to join the University of Manitoba to have this chat. I wish I could be in person. I was in Manitoba a couple years ago. Really enjoyed my time there at the University of Winnipeg. But so maybe in the future, I'll get a chance to come see the University of Manitoba. I have a few friends on the faculty, including one that goes all the way back to my days at Dalhousie, and Professor Bach. I don't know if he's there right now, but thank you for everything. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you about like biographical like fragments of Black people during colonial Canada, and sort of what that meant and how we can look at it. And then we can just like talk about these things. So I'll start with just two people. So after the American Revolution, two Black men named Liberty arrived in the Maritimes. Ironically, they were both still enslaved. In one case, Captain Dunbar planned to take Liberty to St. John, New Brunswick from New York. According to British officials, Liberty, quote, acknowledges to have been purchased by the captain at the West Indies 17 years ago. What we learned from this simple entry in the Book of Negroes, that is a listing of Black people whom the British evacuated from New York, is that Captain Dunbar had purchased Liberty when he was only 8 years old. Of course, we know nothing about Liberty's parents, right? And we don't know if he was actually from the West Indies or if he was actually from Africa. Before being brought to the Maritimes, Liberty had lived in the West Indies, possibly Africa, and New York. And I mean, just gives you an idea of how, you know, Black people who, at least as far as I can tell, end up in the Maritimes, whether you're talking about, you know, the Black loyalist or the slaves of American loyalists, or the Black refugees of the War of 1812, they usually are connected to these much wider points or bigger points in the Atlantic world where you have large scale slave societies. In the other case that I wanted to bring up today, James Lyle enslaved another person named Liberty and brought him to Nova Scotia via St. Augustine, which is in East Florida, for those that are not familiar with that. Previously, in 1782, Liberty was living in Savannah and had been sold to Matthew Lyle before being sold to Matthew's brother, James. Along with Liberty, a mother and daughter named Sarah and Peg were also forced to move to Nova Scotia. These slaves almost certainly noticed the large number of free Black loyalists, right? Those African Americans who gained freedom during the American Revolution by escaping to British lines and sometimes serving and aiding the Crown's war effort, who were part of the migration to Nova Scotia. And although Liberty, Sarah, and Peg share the Black loyalist background as American slaves, they differed from these free Black people because they remained enslaved. And so what I'd like to talk to you all about is, how do we write a history of people like Sarah or Peg or the two Liberties? How can we understand them in all their fullness as human beings, right? The documentation is extremely limited. And in some ways, we have to use what historian Simon Newman in his new book, Freedom Seekers, that you can get free online, was just published. You have to use a little bit of imagination, right? And I think in a way, I always tell my students, I think they always get a little mad at me, but when we want to think about ideas with biography, especially if we're Canadian historians, we don't have to agree with everything that Donald Creighton thought or wrote or sent in a letter to somebody, right? And we certainly don't have to agree with what one of our famous professors at Dalhousie, P.B. Waite, wrote or thought. But some of the things that they do in their biographies, I think we can apply to enslaved Black people and also to Indigenous people. And maybe that's something that we should think about, right? As Canadian historians. So let's go a step further with this. And then, and once I get through this, then I'm happy to take a lot of questions and comments. So I think the stories of Liberty, they embody the essence of what I try to do in this biographical dictionary that I wrote that I think it just came out today or tomorrow with the University of Toronto Press. I actually don't have a copy of it yet, and the whole point is that I want to illuminate the lives of enslaved Black people in the Maritimes, but also like a little bit larger, in colonial Canada, if I can use that phrasing. And of course, like many things, when it comes to the study of Black people in Canada, we have to go back to the work of Paul Lovejoy, even though he does African history, because, in 1996, before people really got into the study of biography in the Black Atlantic, he said, in a paper at a conference, he said, in studying slavery and the slave trade, biography can capture details of history by reinserting individuals into the reality of slavery. Biographies put flesh on the bones of the past. And I think in the biographical dictionary that I published, I really hoped that I could put, flesh on the bones of the past, right? I wanted to make concrete the individual lives of enslaved Black people who lived in the Maritimes. But in doing that, I want to be clear that by focusing on individuals, that doesn't mean that I don't care about Black communities in the Maritimes. I've written about those extensively, but in my more recent work, I've really tried to focus on individuals. And I want to say that although my work focuses on Black slavery, the biographical approach can also be applied to understanding the enslavement of Indigenous peoples. The individual lives in this book show the remarkable range of the African experience in the Atlantic world. The men, women, and children that I put in my biographical dictionary, as I was making the point earlier, they came from various points of origin: Africa, the West Indies, South and North Carolina, Maryland, Virginia, and almost all the northern states, especially New York and Massachusetts. And, some of them were born in the Maritimes, which shows that there were generations of enslaved Black people in the region. And I'm not so sure. I think I disagree with my friend and colleague, Frank Mackey, who sort of wants to make the argument that in a place like in Lower Canada, slavery just sort of dies out by 1800. From what I can tell, at least in the Maritimes, slave owners aren't about to give up slavery in 1800. They want it to continue, right? And we can talk about that. Slaves, for me, the ones that I study, and this is just to give a sort of a brief overview if anybody has questions, they worked in a variety of tasks and occupations that can't be summed up by the production of staple crops like sugar, rice, or cotton. And of course, we all know in the New World, I mean, the real reason and the only reason, as far as I can tell, that slavery it becomes what it became in Brazil and in the Caribbean is because of the production of staple crops, right? But what's interesting is that there were a lot of slaves in the New World, whether you're talking, this is a very interesting thing that I'm talking about with one of my graduate students at the University of Calgary, whether you're talking about enslaved Black people in Boston who were domestics or, right, enslaved domestic slaves in Brazilian cities, right? A lot of times we think of small holdings of slaves as only being in, right, the Maritimes or Boston or, you know, Providence or Rhode Island, or something like that. It's not totally true. So for me, what I like about studying slaves in the Maritimes or enslaved people in the Maritimes is to tell the story of their lives, right? How they survived slavery and how, in some cases, they were eventually able to become free. And I guess the big question is like, you know, how do we do justice to these people? How can we document their lives? You know, and I hoped in the book that just came out with the University of Toronto Press that people would just take these names and study them further, right? And create a repository of knowledge about enslaved Black people, you know, in the Maritimes, in a much larger world. And of course, I've been in contact with some of the people that do slave biographies online, and they want to add these people because a lot of times they don't have them, right? Because they didn't know to look there. So I think to me, that's like super important. And so I want to emphasize that and want to emphasize that to, like, you know, graduate students that are, you know, at the University of Manitoba is that, you know, take one of these biographies and take it wherever you can. Don't be afraid, you know, it's like, I think you can do it. So just to go a little bit further with this, you know, I guess what I'm doing here is, as Randy Sparks said in his book, Africans in the Old South, and other historians have pointed out, what I want to do is talk about, you know, the study of smaller topics or smaller units of history. And understandably, I mean, let's face it, if a person thinks about slavery in North America or in the New World, you know, the idea of a Virginian tobacco plantation in 1740 or a Jamaican sugar estate in 1760, obviously, you know, comes to the forefront. But to focus just on those regions rather than, you know, looking more deeply into other experiences outside of that, we're missing the experience of Black people who left the staple producing regions. And as Simon Newman, I was telling you about this guy earlier, this historian said, he said, look, in the British Empire, slavery was defined, enforced, and experienced in dramatically different ways. And I, you know, even in the cold Maritimes, or, you know, slavery found fertile ground, and they produced multiple generations of enslaved people who provided labor for their owners, but who, and this is important, but who also produced food and goods that helped sustain the slave populations in the West Indies. And I want to underline this for the students out there, graduate students. You know, one of my dear graduate students I just had, Sarah Shute, she's now at the University of Toronto, very, very smart. She wrote her MA thesis about the connections between the slavery in the Maritimes and slavery in the West Indies. And I really think this is an area of growth that we could have. Like, there's a lot there that we could still explore. Shirley Tillotson just wrote a wonderful piece about this. I believe it's part of the Dalhousie study of its historic connections with slavery. So I think exploring the lives of enslaved people in the Maritimes not only tells us the story of slavery outside of plantation societies, but it also tells us how they were intimately connected to the economies and empires of Britain, France, and other European empires. So all of these things are going on in this book. Now, whether this is worthwhile or worth your time, that's something that you can decide. But I'll just say this much. For me, the thing that's so shocking about because I would say in the book, there's probably about 1,500, maybe in 67 people documented in the book. Okay. So let's say 1,500, right? Their stories have varying levels of detail, right? And this is what's so interesting. Some are fleshed out because of their interactions with white maritime society, and others had only the dimmest outline of their existence recorded. All, to some extent, had their lives, and we're going to come back to this, silenced by the archives, right? I think Marissa Fuentes and those people are correct about this. And Sadia Hartman and so on and so forth. But the funny thing I got to tell you, and this is the project I'm starting to work on now, is that some of the best stories that we have of enslaved Black people in the Maritimes actually come from enslaved women who went to court to protect themselves or their children. It's very fascinating. But let me go a little bit further with this. What I'm trying to do in this book is bear witness to the existence of these people, and Brett Rushforth, dear colleague and friend, makes this point in his book, Bonds of Alliance. I want us to recognize that enslaved Black people in the Maritimes had, just like Upper and Lower Canada and PEI, right, had likes and dislikes, good traits and bad ones, in various levels of physical, spiritual, and intellectual talent. And we must affirm the notion that these slaves were unique individuals, despite the efforts of their owners in the wider British Atlantic world to dehumanize them, right? They were people, and their actions to keep their families together and fight for their dignity are poignantly told in some of the biographies that I unearthed for the book, but also stuff that I, have been doing for the last 10, 12 years. And, let me just give you, if you all don't mind, a few quick examples, because even when we know a lot about an individual, because we get lucky and get, like, I don't know, a court case, or we get lucky and we get, a runaway slave advertisement, which historian David Waldstreicher called the first slave narratives, and he's right. It's interesting because everyone, even the ones that we know a fair amount about, we still don't really know that much. And so then the question becomes, how do we fill this in, right? How do we fill this in? How much leeway do we have as historians to not invent history, but to elaborate on the documentation that's there, right? And I'll get to that in a second. So, for example, one of my favorite slave ads. It's on the cover of, I think it's the 2018 book I did on Black slavery in the Maritimes. It's a runaway slave ad, and it describes this guy who has named himself Bill. Now, you're probably wondering, like, who cares, right? Well, his owner, Michael Wallace, who was a loyalist, of course, but I think named him Belfast, right? Which is for obvious reasons, right? Which is an insulting name. So this guy says, no, actually, I prefer the name Bill. And so in the runaway slave ad, Wallace says, well, at the time of his elopement, he was in the service of William Forsyth, Esquire. And for the students there and other people, when you're reading these things, it's super important to get every little last detail. So here, because we know he's in the service of William Forsyth, that means he was hired out. That means that his owner let him go work for this person, or his owner let William Forsyth have Bill, and William Forsyth was paying Wallace for that. Then he says, Bill has meditated an attempt to get on board a ship which lay in the harbor bound to Newfoundland, but was frustrated. It was not uncommon for Black people to try to become sailors and go to Newfoundland from Nova Scotia, just so you know. It is probable, however, that he may still endeavor to escape that way. And then, of course, Michael Wallace threatens all people who own ships to not take him. But listen to how he describes Bill. He says, Bill is a likely stout-made fellow of 5 feet 8 or 9 inches high and about 27 years of age. He's of mild good countenance and features, smooth black skin with very white teeth. Is a native of South Carolina, speaks good English and very softly, and has been in this province for 10 years. When he went off, and he wore an old bath coating short coat of light color, and he sort of goes into a description about this. But then he says at the end of the ad, as Bill had other clothes secreted in town, he may have changed his whole apparel. He will no doubt endeavor to pass for a free man and possibly by some other name. That's a lot of information. Now, I know you're probably thinking, Professor, that's not really that much information, but hear me out. Due to the wealth of detail provided by an owner desperate to find his enslaved property, Bill is among the more fleshed out characters in maritime slavery. Now, there are historians who would argue that the archive about slavery is based on violence, right? And these descriptions are based on a form of, if not physical violence, emotional violence. And how do we use these sources in the right way, if at all, right? So let me go a step further with this. But we don't know that much about Bill. We don't know if he had any family in Nova Scotia, right? Was he running away to find his wife or his children? What daily tasks did he do? We might be able to get an idea of that. What was his experience during the American Revolution? How many different owners did he have before Michael Wallace? Why did he run away? Mistreatment, hope of freedom, searching for a loved one, or all of the above? So it's a bunch of those things, you know? And everybody, in contrast to the comparative wealth of detail that we have about somebody like Bill, there are other times we don't know anything. It'll say, slave woman, Black woman for sale, age 17. And they don't even put her name there. Like they can't even be bothered to do that. And I have a bunch of examples about that, and I hesitate to give them because they're so depressing. But here's one I like, because it actually says something interesting about his family. This is from James Haight, who lived in New Brunswick. He was selling a slave, and he said, for sale, a Black boy, 14 years of age, in full vigor of health, very active, has a pleasing countenance and every ability to render himself useful and agreeable in a family. Give you one more. This is also in my book, but I hope everybody hears this. This was a public auction, okay? And it was for the property of a guy by the name of Charles McPherson. Now, if you're wondering, he was just an innkeeper. And you're probably wondering, Professor, who cares, right? Well, the reason I'm telling you that he was just an innkeeper is I want you to understand that it's not like the only people who are owning slaves are like the top of colonial society, right? They're not. A lot of them are, they're pretty middling, right? And a good example was a local innkeeper named Charles McPherson. And basically, so they had an auction at something called the Exchange Coffee House in this city, right? Of course, St. John, on Monday next at 12 o'clock. And I want you to hear what they offer. 46 hogsheads of London porter, 2 hogsheads, 4 casks, and a box of bottled ale. Clearly, he likes to have his drink, and I can't really blame him. Tables, chairs, benches, looking glasses, clock and case, beds and bedstead, pictures, glass lamps. Also, and this in caps lock, a Negro man and boy, a slope-rigged vessel with mast, bowsprit, sails, wagon, birch boards, empty gin cases, and a variety of other articles too tedious to mention. So I think everybody, what I'm trying to get at there is what you hear there is the fact that, yeah, they were offered for sale at an auction, but the man and the boy, what do we know about them? Who are these people? Where are they from? I mean, are the man and the boy related? Is it dad and son, or is just like, it's a dude and a child? I don't know. I mean, it could be, we don't know. That's the point. And if it is the father and the son, where's the mother? They already sold her. She died. Who knows? So I think when we talk about biographical fragments, that's what I mean, right? It's like, there's only so much that I can say. And everybody, I will not lie, the stories in the Maritimes are fragmentary, right? We do not have, to my knowledge yet, though who knows what we'll find, you don't ever really know, but not that I've ever heard of. There's no Aludo Equiano, there's no Phyllis Wheatley, right? There's nobody like that, right? There's no Mary Prince, there's no Sojourner Truth. We haven't found that yet, you know? I have gone through very carefully the narratives of free Black people like, David George and Boston King and those sorts of people. But I think it's going to be hard to write full-length biographies, but I don't think that we give up. Okay. I don't believe that. I feel like, for me at least, they talked about in that advertisement, they said, well, this is happening at the so-and-so coffee house at this place in St. John. So you got to recreate that coffee house. And that's what Simon Newman does in his book, Freedom Seekers, because what he does is brilliant. He looks at runaway slave ads in early modern London, I want to say. Professor Bach might correct me on my timing here, but I think 1660, 1670, some of the earliest ads. And all they know is here's this person, but they get the slave owner's name, and Newman knew the neighborhoods. He's like recreating. So every day he's probably doing this. He's probably going by this. Well, you better believe that those two slaves in that advertisement at the place that they're getting sold, they're probably pretty familiar with that coffee house. They're probably pretty familiar with some of these shipping things. So what do we do with that? So everybody, let me just leave you maybe with one last thing, and then we can just have time for plenty of questions. Is that all right with everybody? So yeah, I'm sure some people are familiar with Diana Bastian. Diana Bastian was a young girl who was described in 1792 as belonging, and I'm direct quote here, a Negro girl belonging to Abraham Cuyler, Esquire. For those of you who are not familiar with the American background of most loyalists, Abraham Cuyler was the mayor of Albany, New York, prior to right up until the American Revolution. And eventually he came to the Maritimes and he went to Cape Breton. I think he eventually went to Quebec, if my memory serves me correctly. But anyway, he was the former mayor of Albany. You're probably thinking, Professor, who cares? He gets to Cape Breton, and Diana Bastian at that time probably would have only been 7 years old. Okay. So, be that as it may, we've mentioned this concept of archival silences, right? And the experience of enslaved people, and the Bastian case is no exception. But here's the interesting thing: we find something out about her that we would never have known if we didn't get lucky. Hear me out. Unfortunately, her life was anything but lucky. We have no idea who her parents were or what happened to them. We don't know if Cuyler owned her parents or if he was her father. We don't really know. All we know is that Cuyler gets to Cape Breton, and he serves on the colony's executive council. And despite fighting with the governor and others, remained a powerful political presence in Cape Breton. He had a companion who was a Royal Navy officer. His name was George Moore, and he was also a member of council, but for whatever reason, and you'll pardon me, he proceeded to commit an act of sexual violence, the R word. I know that word can be jarring to somebody, so, but basically that's what he did. He was impregnated Bastian. He was 44, so he's around my age, and Bastian was probably 14, maybe 15. And then, as my friend Afua Cooper says, that Diana Bastian was, and Afua uses the word raped and impregnated by a much older man, and then abandoned, points to the vulnerable and precarious position of a young enslaved Black girl who, by virtue of their status, had no rights or honor and thus were deemed unworthy of masculine protection. But here's what I want to tell you all. The only reason why we know anything about Diana Bastian's life is because a recorder at the Anglican Church thought what happened to her was so disgusting that he actually just recorded her life, just a few sentences. It's very messy. It's hard to read if anybody's ever seen the document. All it says is, and we just want to hear it, and then we'll take some questions. He said, buried Diana Bastian, a Negro girl belonging to Abraham Cuyler, in the 15th year of her age. Now, listen to the wording here, everybody. This wording is interesting. He says, she was deluded and ruined at Government House by George Moore, Esquire, the naval officer and one of Governor McCormick's counsel, by whom she was pregnant with twins and delivered of but one of them. She most earnestly implored the favor of Mr. Moore's brother Justice to be admitted to her oath concerning her pregnancy by him, but was refused that with every other assistance by him and them. And I think her life is a reminder that while historians can write short biographical sketches, it's going to be tough to do more. We'd have to find out more. And how do you do that work? Anyway, so, well, everybody, thanks so much. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Well, thank you very, very much